One of the remarkable things about the Bible, which most people don't know, even Christians don't think about it, is the fact that it's a story. The Old Testament, half of the Old Testament is a story, and half of the New Testament is a story. You start off with Genesis, and that's a story. The whole thing is a story. You go to Exodus, and most of it's a story. And yes, there's the law in Leviticus, yes, but there's also the story in Leviticus, and the story in Numbers, and the story in Deuteronomy. The story is so important. And then it just keeps on going. The story goes from one book to the next book to the next book until you get to the book of Esther. And then the story goes on hold for 400 some years. And then the story reopens in the book of Matthew. So let's share a screen here. I'm just going to share screen this way this time. And let's pop over to the beginning of Matthew. The historical record. What? Yeah. The historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then it goes back to the story. Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob. It's as if Matthew says, all right, that story is continuing on here. That story that you read in the Old Testament that began in Genesis 1 and sort of came to its conclusion in Esther, but it's not really a conclusion at all. It's a waiting thing. And then talked about by the prophets, that story is the same story that I'm telling you, says Matthew. That story is the same story that I'm telling you. And interestingly, Matthew thinks that the story needs to talk about genealogy. So you'll notice that my Holman Christian Standard calls it the historical record, and my New American Standard Bible calls it the genealogy. Genealogy is fine. It's a Genesis, which has that idea of a genealogy. So what we have here is this story of the passing on from one generation to the next of the seed. So I can say confidently that a very, very important part of biblical theology is that story. That story is rooted, deeply rooted in the promise that was made to Adam and Eve. And the Bible is really that story. So biblical theology has to do with the story. Now, biblical theology obviously can be more than that. For example, you can do a biblical theology of worship. And if you do a biblical theology of worship, well, you begin in Genesis and you follow through how worship and music and singing and whatever ends up being sacrifice and all that, how all of those things fit together, and you follow that through Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, etc., all the way through. Yes, you can do that, and that's good. And that's not exactly the story, but even so, you need to know the story, how everything fits into it. Now, some things don't fit into the story real clearly, like, for example, the book of Proverbs, which is about how a young man, or a young woman, but it's addressed to a young man, how can a young man be successful in life? Proverbs is more than that, but it's not any less than that. Or Song of Solomon, which seems to be a celebration of sex and marriage. Or the book of Ecclesiastes. How do these wisdom books fit into the story? But in some way they do. We don't want to change the story to fit them in. We don't want to change those books to fit them in. But somehow, everything in some way is all woven into the story. The story is a part of it. You can't read the prophets without the story. You can't read the New Testament without the Old Testament story. It just doesn't work. And so you can see here, Matthew felt the same way. He wanted us to realize, look at this. He wanted us to realize the story he's about to tell, it's connected to the story that Moses started in Genesis chapter 1. It's all connected together, okay? So I'm going to go through a PowerPoint, and this PowerPoint is going to talk about that story. It's called God's salvation story. I'm calling it God's salvation story, and I'm saying that this story is about three major themes. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I can ask the question, why is the world in such a mess? And the world isn't such a mess. And there's so much suffering, so much pain, so much heartbreak, and it's so confusing. Why? What happened? Where did it come from? Well, it never was supposed to be this way. This is not the way God created the world. How could a good God have created a world with so much suffering? Oh my gosh, so much suffering. I've seen so much suffering this week. So the Bible answers that question, although the Bible is not written to answer that question in the sense of giving us a philosophical answer. The Bible is written to bring us face to face with God's answer to the problem and God's solution to the problem. And we can't read the Bible without deciding what we're going to do with God's solution. It begins with the creation and the fall, and then to redemption in Christ, and then in the new heavens and the new earth. And I want you to notice this. It begins with this creation and fall, then it's all about the redemption that we have in Jesus Christ, and then it's about the coming of the new heavens and the new earth. So, the old heavens and the old earth were great until sin came into the world, which was at the beginning. The new heavens and the new earth have no sin, no death, no destruction. Now, you know already, but not everybody in the world knows. The story does not begin in death and suffering, but begins in the Garden of Eden, where humans fellowship with God in perfect paradise. However, at the beginning of the story, and I mean at the beginning, in chapter 3, at the very beginning of the story, humans were exiled from living in God's presence and end up in this world of death. So all of those pictures we saw of all of that suffering, this is where it comes from, because humans are living in exile from God. Much of the Bible's story is about humanity living in exile from God's holy presence. And as you know, so much of the story of the Bible is about sin. And it's about death, and it's about Satan's rule. Sometimes Satan isn't mentioned, but it's always seen. And the hand of Satan is always present in the suffering and the struggle and the disaster that fills the world. You can see Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, the Tower of Babel, the worshiping of the golden calf. I don't know what that picture is. And then the destruction of Jerusalem, and they're taken into exile. But the story doesn't end here at the grave. Buddhists think the story ends at the grave, but it doesn't. The story ends at a new beginning, the new heavens and the new earth. So it's not an accident that the final book in the New Testament, which is probably the last book written, that final book is about the new heavens and the new earth. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea no longer existed. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride, adorned for her husband. That's where we're going. Don't forget that that's where we're going. And don't let the people you minister to think that we're just going to heaven. No, we're going to a new heavens and a new earth, the New Jerusalem and glory. So the heart of the story, in my understanding, is living in God's presence. You can see living in God's presence in the book of Revelation. It is a major part of the book of Revelation. It's really the fulfillment of the book of Revelation is when we can live in God's presence without shame or fear forever and ever and ever. And that's the heart of that. And God's presence is also there at the beginning as well. That's the heart of the story. I heard a loud voice from the throne. Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Here's one of the most amazing statements. I did not see a temple in it because God, the Lord, God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. So the temple is not the story of the Bible. It's the place of God's presence that's the real story. So the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it because God's glory illumines it. And its lamp is the Lamb. Is that an awesome statement or what? So the story is not about the temple. It's about the presence of God, which is our eternal temple. So the Bible tells the story of how God brought humanity, exiled from his presence, back into his presence in the new heavens and the new earth. Don't think that the temple is where we're going. That's just a step along the way. No. It's the new heavens and the new earth. And it's very interesting that when God revealed his plan to the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, so much of what I see in the book of Revelation is a reflection of the original Garden of Eden. It's as if God created the Garden of Eden sort of like as a picture of what the new heavens and the new earth were going to be like. So God's salvation story, part one, a king and queen living in God's presence. When God created the world in the beginning, and you notice I say that because that's what the Bible says, it wasn't 14 billion years after the beginning, he appointed the man and woman as king and queen over creation. You know, at first I was uncomfortable with this idea, but I'm not uncomfortable with it at all anymore because it's true. It's a fact. God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, all the earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth." So God created man, created him in his man in his image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. Let us make man. They will rule. Well, that's the word for what a king does, a queen does. They will rule. So the first two things we learn about humans, God made them in his image. God created them to rule. That's their purpose. You find a hammer. Okay, what's the purpose of this hammer? Well, the person who made it. What they make it for? Well, pounding nails. That's its purpose. What's the purpose of human beings? Well, God created them to rule. Now, of course, first and above all, God ruled the universe, and he appointed the man and the woman to rule all the earth as his images. As we already said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, they will rule. In other words, we don't rule because we have some inherent ability. We do. We have lots and lots and lots and lots of amazing abilities that no animal has except for us. But it's not just that. We rule because God said, I want my ambassadors, or I want my sort of like vice rulers, we are under God, but we have God's authority on earth to do his mission of ruling the planet. And that's what we do. That's the main meaning of being in God's image, is the fact that we rule. On earth, men and women were to rule as if they were God himself. And that's true. We were to rule as if we were God himself. All earth was to bow before the man and the woman the way all heaven bows before God. That's the whole idea that's going on here. And God's blessing on the man and the woman, rule. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the ground. God commanded them to have many children, who also would have many children. God commanded them to subdue the earth and to rule over all of the creatures. That was the plan. As rulers of God's creation, the king and queen had authority under God and responsibility to their planet. So there's the king and queen, but they're under God. And creation, all creatures on earth, are under the humans. It's really important to realize that's the order that's supposed to be. God over king and queen, over creatures on earth. As long as the king and queen were properly under God, they exercised perfect authority over the creatures of earth. That after they had chosen to eat the fruit, that if they ate, she said, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, if they ate from the tree of life, they would live forever, but they would live forever broken, fallen, decaying, awful. It's like having cancer 1,000 times over every day. It would have been terrible. So they had to be kicked out of the garden because of that. So God also created a second tree next to the tree of life. This tree was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So God gave his king and queen a choice. They could choose to allow God to tell them what was good or bad, or they could demand their own knowledge without God. Tree of knowledge of good and evil is about knowledge. It's about who's going to tell me what's good and who's going to tell me what's not good. By the way, the knowledge that they get from the tree of knowledge of evil is false knowledge. It's not real. Okay? How do I know that? Because when Adam and Eve ate, their eyes are open and they see differently and they think it's wrong to be naked, and it's not. So it's like they have bad knowledge, but they still make their decisions based on it. So God made the choice simple. Eat the fruit from the tree of life and live in God's presence forever, or eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and die apart from God's presence forever. The king and queen chose independence from God and therefore chose death. And when the king and queen chose independence from God, the proper order of creation switched. The king and queen went over God, or at least on the same level as God. Not really. But they did in practice. That's what they did. They decided before that, it was God decides what's good and what's not good, because God's the one that made it. He knows what's good and not good. If someone creates a hammer, they know what that hammer is supposed to be used for, right? If you use the hammer for the wrong purpose, like hitting people on the head, the hammer isn't bad, but you are bad because you're using something that was created for a good thing and you're using it for a bad thing. Okay, now that's what we do. And the human beings were created to be God's rulers on earth, but they were created to be God's rulers on earth in submission to God. And when they refused to submit to God and they tried to put themselves on the same level as God, well, then the whole world became crazy. And the creatures on earth became the rulers over the king and queen. Humanity's in a terrible position. The only hope of life is in the presence of God. And this is so important. But they're terrified of God's presence. In other words, the only thing that can save them is God. But they're terrified of his presence. They were created in the presence of God. They've lived in the presence of God, but now they're like threatened by it. And so what do? Well, stupidly, they think they can hide their sins, so they cover themselves with leaves. But leaves aren't going to protect them from God's holiness. That's not going to do any good. So they try to protect themselves from God's holiness, but it never works. And that's what human religion is. Human religion is trying to return to Eden or to the presence of God, but trying to do it without coming face to face with God's terrifying presence. Because God's terrifying presence is holy, and God's holiness exposes sin. That's just what it does. People create religions so that they can feel good about the relationship with God, feel like they have peace with God, feel like they're in control of their lives without actually having to come face to face with this terrifying God's presence. Adam and Eve covered themselves with leaves, did no good. Humans try to cover themselves with religion or philosophy or culture or whatever. In the end, there is one problem in the universe, and that problem is that humans are constantly choosing for themselves what they think is good and what they think is evil. Yes, there's your story of the Bible right there. That's why the Old Testament is such a discouraging book. And when you read the story is so discouraging because even David goes bad. Why? Because humans are constantly choosing for themselves. That's what they're constantly doing. They say, oh, no, this is good. Oh, no, this is good. Oh, no, this is good. So how could a good God create a world with so much suffering leading to a world of death? How did this happen? What's going on? Well, it happened because of sin. It happened because humans decided that they were going to overthrow God's choice. They weren't going to let God tell them what was good. They were going to choose for themselves what's good. And when humans do that, end in death. So the Bible is God's salvation story, telling God's plan, which ends in the new heavens and the new earth. We do get to the new heavens and the new earth. Not everybody gets there. We have creation and fall. We have redemption in Christ. And we have the new heavens and the new earth. Okay, so there's hope, and here's the hope. It's right here. It's this verse. This is what God said to the snake. It's this promise. Everything in God's salvation story comes out of this promise. This is something you'll see in Dr. Kaiser's article. I will put hostility between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He, who's the he? The seed of the woman. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. This is not the end, but it's only not the end because of Jesus Christ. Because this promise keeps us alive. Yes, Satan is going to bite Jesus Christ, but Jesus Christ is going to crush Satan. And that's the hope of the Bible, that we're going to be set free from our slavery to death. This is the beginning, world without end. So yeah, there is a beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That was at the beginning. Yes, absolutely. But at the very beginning, Jesus tells us that at the very beginning, that Adam and Eve broke their fellowship with God. That's what they told us. So this is the beginning, world without end. Here it is. The Bible is God's salvation story, telling of God's plan, which leads to the new heavens and the new earth. And it's really important, all three of these. We've got the presence of God in creation and fall. We've got the seed from Eve in redemption. And we've got the new heavens and the new earth. That's the place of God's presence. And obviously, all of this comes through Jesus. And so, not exaggerating, Jesus Christ is the story of the Bible. How can I say that? Because Jesus Christ is where it begins. When they sin, God says to the snake that the woman and the woman's seed and Satan's seed will hate each other, and Satan will bite the woman's seed on the heel, but he will crush Satan's head. And so this is the promise, and this is the story, and that's Jesus. He's the seed of Eve. He's the one who's going to come and rescue us from our sin. So what's going on here then is that in this course, we're going to talk a lot about God's salvation story. Decided to make this to be the central theme of our class. We're going to follow God's salvation story. We're going to talk about typology. We're going to talk about prophecy. And we're going to talk about how this all fits together with the Old Testament and the New Testament and all of those things. Because I believe that what's going on in the Bible is telling this story, that the story is the center of the Bible. It's the center of redemption. It's the center of what we need to understand when we read the Bible. And so biblical theology is more than that story. But biblical theology is never less than that story. The story is always there at the center of biblical theology. Okay, so this is our introduction to the great story of redemption, God's great salvation story.